Hey everybody, in this video we're going to talk about image classification and spectral separability. So what is image classification? Essentially our goal is to go from an image, a satellite image in this case, which is just a bunch of data. It's a bunch of numbers. And we want to turn that image into a map in which each pixel in the map is part of some class. It has some meaning to human users. So for example, here's a soil map that shows different types of soil across a large area. Imagine that we could use a satellite image in which each pixel in the image had a unique spectral signature that was representative of a different soil type, and we could automatically convert those pixels into a soil type class. That's the type of thing we're trying to do. And of course, this doesn't have to be limited just to digital numbers in a satellite image. It can also include all kinds of data. So you might combine a satellite imagery with other data, whether it's weather data like precipitation or temperature or lightning strikes, or vegetation type. You can actually combine lots of different types of information into a classified map. For example, in this map of fire danger, which uses all these different variables. And I want to build on fire danger for an example that we're going to use in this video and in upcoming videos. And we're going to look at if we can classify Yellowstone National Park after the 1988 Yellowstone wildfires burned over 800,000 acres, roughly a third of the park. Absolutely devastating wildfires. And so they have a huge impact on infrastructure, habitat, wildlife, and it really pays to know very quickly the extent of what was burned, right? And create a map of what was burned for management. So for example, here's a Landsat image collected after those 1988 wildfires. And you can see a lot of these burned areas, kind of in this like bluish gray color here. So what if we could turn this satellite image, this data, into a map in which the map showed us classes of burned and unburned areas? So let's look now at some of the theory of classification. How are we going to do this? Okay, so the key idea is that we're going to define a bunch of classes called user classes. And in this simple example, this might be water, sand, forest, urban, corn, and hay. So maybe you have 6 different classes or kind of surface types in your image. And each of these, hopefully, has a different spectral signature. So each of these plots shows, in bar graph form, unfortunately, the spectral reflectance signature. So water reflects a lot in the visible and then reflects less as you go out in the infrared. Sand reflects high in all of the satellite bands, okay? So each of these classes or land cover types has a different spectral signature, reflectance signature. And classification is going to exploit those by considering each pixel in turn and asking which of these signatures is this closest to. So here's how that works in practice. We've got a raster input. In this case, it's a multi-band raster. So we have our 5 different satellite bands. And we're going to go through pixel by pixel. And from each pixel, extract the spectral signature. Okay, so that would be 5 different numbers, a number for band 1, a number for band 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on, right? And then we're going to actually categorize, classify that spectral signature, and then assign one class to that pixel. In this case, it was assigned to be forest, or F, whereas other pixels were assigned to be corn, or urban, and so on and so forth. So it's important to recognize that there's 2 types of classes in classification. One is called a user class, and that's what we've been talking about so far. These are classes that are defined by the user and are usually things that are of interest to the user, like corn, grass, or hay. The other type is spectral classes. These are classes of pixel, or groups of pixels or classes, that are spectrally similar. They just look the same in terms of their spectral reflectance, even though they may not actually fall within the same user class. So it may be that you have, some pixels of corn and some pixels of hay that look identical spectrally. They look very similar. They might make up their own kind of spectral class, even though unfortunately they bridge two different user classes. And there's also two types of classification, and these are going to be the topic of our next two videos after this. One is supervised classification. So that's where we basically divide the image into user classes. And so we start by actually providing training data for each class. So you, the user, would say, hey, I'm going to tell the computer, this is what corn looks like spectrally, this is what hay looks like spectrally, and then run an algorithm to actually do the classification. But you're defining the classes and you're telling it what they look like. That's in contrast to unsupervised classification, where essentially you let the computer automatically divide the image into spectral classes without telling it what specific classes you might be looking for. Depending on the algorithm, you can tell how many classes or other tweaks, and we'll have a whole video on that. But the important difference is you do not provide training information in unsupervised classification, typically. Okay, so let's go back to our Yellowstone example. In this case, we're going to pick 5 user classes: trees, burned trees, bedrock, meadows, and water. And the way we're going to get our training data is actually by circling each of these. So here's water. We're going to gather up values for all the pixels within that circle. Here's meadow. We're going to gather up values for all the pixels in this circle. Here's burned, unburned, and then here's bedrock down here, okay? So let's consider what do the spectral signatures of these 5 user classes look like. So here's what burned trees looks like. This is a histogram where we have the brightness or the digital number on the x-axis and the number of pixels on the y-axis. And you can see that this is just in some one arbitrary band. You can see that there's a huge spread. Some of the burned pixels are really, really dark, and some of the burned pixels can be brighter. So there's a huge spread. It's not very unique. And it makes sense. Look at this burned hill slope right here. We see everything from black to orange, a little bit of green and gray sticking through. So lots of different colors there. All right, so what about the bedrock class? In Yellowstone National Park, the bedrock actually has a lot of rhyolite flows. These are volcanic lava flows. And although there's some shadows and texture, compared with the burned forest, it has a relatively narrow distribution of brightness values. So the bedrock class has a more tight distribution, more unique distribution of brightness values. And then finally, let's look at meadow. So the meadow, I guess I don't have the example here, but these meadows are quite homogeneous, as are water. So we're going to see in a second, those have much more narrow distributions of pixel values. Okay, so quick diversion into statistics here. So I just showed that burned areas have a big spread in values, and something like water is going to have a really small spread in values. How do we actually quantify those spreads? To do that, we use a metric called the standard deviation. Okay, and the standard deviation, you can look up the formula, but I'll explain it in words here. Essentially, if you have a distribution of data values, okay, there you can compute a mean or an average. Okay, so in this plot, the average is 0. Okay, this is the normalized standard Gaussian curve here. So imagine that your average was 0. It wouldn't be usually, but standard deviation, this is essentially a probability curve that shows, or you can also think of it as a histogram, that shows the probability of drawing any particular value from your distribution of pixel values. So for example, the probability of drawing the mean is the highest, right? That's the one that occurs the most often, perhaps. The probability of drawing something out, at -3 is much less, out at the tail of your distribution. So it's the shape of this kind of distribution that determines how tightly packed or how spread out your data is. So if your data are spread all over the place, you'll have a wide standard deviation. This curve will be very, very wide. And if they're packed tightly, this curve will be very narrow. And if the data are normally distributed, roughly 68% of your data falls within one standard deviation here. 95% of your data falls within 2 standard deviations. And 99.7% falls within 3 standard deviations. So in sum, when you compute a standard deviation, okay, essentially what you're saying is that is a number. Let's say it's plus or minus 1 for the sake of example here. That means that 68% of your pixel values fall within plus or minus 1 of the mean, okay? But if your standard deviation was plus or minus 10, that would imply your data was much more spread out, and that 68% of your data fell within 10 of the mean, much more spread out. So I hope this makes sense. So let's look now at how we would apply this. So what we're going to construct is a spectral separability plot. And we're going to plot the mean and standard deviation of each of our training groups. So let's go through this. Let's start with water. So water's in blue. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spectral bands, okay? And we extracted the mean value for each of those spectral bands. So we have 7 data points for water that are the average of all the water pixels. And now let's look at, for example, burned trees. That's in purple. Same thing. Here's the purple curve. So notice it is spectrally different than water. It's not the same. It has a different curve, which suggests we might be able to tell it apart. But also notice these error bars. So those error bars are showing the 1 standard deviation uncertainty on the mean for each band. And you can see, as we discussed, the burned pixels have a lot more scatter. So their standard deviation here is, plus or minus 7 or something like that. In contrast, the water pixels are clustered so tightly in their reflectance values that their standard deviation is so tiny it's less than 1, and it doesn't even show up on our plot, okay? And the reason, right, that water has the smallest variability and the smallest standard deviation is because it's very homogeneous. All the water pixels are made 100% of water, right? In contrast, the burned pixels are a huge spread. Some of them are burned trees, some of them are half-burned trees, some of them are burned trees plus soil or plus rock. So there's a lot of variability within that burned category, which is leading us to a big spread, and that's going to ultimately make it harder to separate from the other classes, because the bigger these standard deviation error bars are, the more overlap there's going to be with the other classes. And in certain places, like here, we see the error bars themselves fully overlap. So what that means is Meadow and Bedrock really cannot be reliably distinguished in band 5. However, they may be reliably distinguished over here in band 4, where they don't overlap. Great. So wrapping up here, we've shown that the standard deviation, or the spread on a given spectral reflectance curve, can be controlled by the size of the training area. Right? If you draw a big polygon and you collect pixels from a big area, you may have more variability. But more importantly, it's controlled by the variability within the surface class. How many mixed pixels do you have? So is it then better to have a large or a small training area? Well, large areas capture the full variability but end up being less unique. But in the end, if your goal is to reliably classify pixels and to actually understand if you can classify certain surface types, usually you want to know what the full variability is, right? Even if it makes your spread bigger. If you use a small training area, you're going to capture less variability. You may have a more unique signature, but it may not be representative of the entire surface class. Finally, if you're interested in quantitative metrics, I'll just leave you with this metric of normalized distance, which is a statistical measure of separability for any specific band. So it would be the difference between the digital numbers between spectra A and B divided by the sum of their standard deviations. So you'd compute this normalized distance for any particular spectral band, and it's a measure of how separable they are. So in summary, classification assigns each pixel to a class. Essentially, we're going from data into a map, right? A usable map. Pixels are distinguished by their spectral reflectance curves, but you can also use other data. You can bring in lots and lots of data into a classification algorithm. Pixels cannot be distinguished if there's too much spectral overlap. Essentially, if the input data or the training data is not unique between two classes, then they can't be separated. Spectral variability within a class depends on the complexity of that surface type. And spectral separability plots can be used to kind of visually assess how separable different classes are. And those separability plots are simply a plot of the mean spectral signatures with the standard deviations to see how much overlap there is. Stay tuned for our next video where we'll look at supervised classification. Thanks.